Alrighty. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, as I mentioned, this will be recorded, so if you miss anything, not a big deal. Thanks for joining us, everybody. My name is Karl Hughes, CEO here at the Podcast Consultant, and with me today are Dave and, gosh, I'm going to butcher your last name, Dave. Chatziliadis. How do you
That's
say it?
really good. Yeah, yeah. That's it.
I don't think I was close at all.
It's amazing.
Oh, I'm just gonna laugh at myself. And Robert Van Vranken, who I could say yours because of the space in the middle. That gives me a nice break point.
There you go.
Good to see you guys. We all work together here at the Podcast Consultant, so know each other a bit. But thanks for joining, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about um, should you and how should you upgrade your podcast from audio to video? I guess we're kind of giving away the answer to the should by calling it an upgrade, which we didn't mean to do. But I think upgrade just in this case implies that it's more work to go from generally speaking a audio show to a video show. So there's an upgrade in stuff you have to have as well as work, but we'll talk about all that. Like I mentioned, CEO at the Podcast Consultant, Robert helps me out with our launches for new shows and audits for existing shows. And since we've been launching a lot of video podcasts in the last 12 to 18 months, figured I'd bring him in to share. And then Dave does a lot of the behind the scenes video editing work for us as well as other clients. And so Dave's great as far as video editors and producers to work with. And so always been one of our favorites over here. Robert came on and goes, Dave, I'm a big fan of your work.
One of the
We're all
best.
secret fans of his work. So
Huge
thanks for
fan.
joining, Dave. And then we will get into it. So we'll talk about a few things here about whether you should or shouldn't be considering a video podcast and the reasons why. We'll talk about some of the things you need to think about when starting or migrating to a video show, equipment, as well as some of the challenges that you're going to face. Obviously, in theory, just it looks easy. You just turn on the webcam and now you've got a video podcast, but there is a little more that could go on behind the scenes depending on how far you want to take it. And then we'll kind of get into the future of video podcasting as well towards the end, kind of some of our thoughts on, is it the only way forward if you're starting a new show now, or do all shows have to convert to video, or is it going to be one of those optional points where half the shows are, half the shows aren't for the future? Hard to say, but I'm sure we all have some interesting thoughts on that topic. So if you see something you wanted to ask about that's not mentioned in this list, feel free to, again, leave it in the chat. We'll have some time for questions at the end. But without further ado, I will go ahead and take my screen down and we will get started. So the first one is this is a big question. It's going to probably touch on a few of the key points. We'll dive into more in detail in the next one. But I already kind of hinted at this. A lot of people might assume that releasing a video podcast is as simple as taking your audio setup, turning on a webcam, recording the video, and then boom, dump the same thing, the content out there on YouTube. But I think there's more to it than that. So wanted to get you guys' take on some of the things that people are missing when they assume that it's just that easy to start a video show. What are some of the things you have to think about that you don't have to think about when you're doing an audio only show? And I guess we'll start with Dave. Anything that comes top of mind for you, and then I'll kick it over to Robert next as well.
For starters, every videographer, cinematographer will tell you audio is number one. So people will watch something that's of medium quality but good audio, but they are not going to sit around if it's cinematic, amazing shot, but the audio's junk. So audio is it needs to be pristine or as good as you can get it.
Right.
After that, I think it's quite easy entering the video space. And mind you, I said entering the video space. Because right now I'm just using an iPhone to record video. And if you've got anything like Samsung, everything is integrated, so you don't need a separate webcam. I just say just see what you've got around you and just start with using that. And if anything, you'll just incrementally get better instead of trying to get all the gear and then
Right.
Getting stumped because you can't figure out settings and white balance and all that kind of stuff. Just start with what you've got in your pocket. And trust the process, and you'll just get incrementally better the more you do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this is something that Robert and I both mention a lot on our launch calls is like, look, your first goal is get the show out there and get, let's call it 10 episodes, but whatever that arbitrary goal line is, get some episodes out there and then start worrying about how do I upgrade my video quality? How do I upgrade my lighting? Maybe there's a lot there that you can get into, but it's absolutely more important that you just get used to actually having video recorded and making sure your guests are okay with it, making sure you're okay with it, some basic stuff. So there's kind of a tier list there. Robert, we've talked about this a lot with clients during launches. What are some of the challenges to moving to video that people often slow people down, or might be something that people aren't aware of?
Yeah, well, I would say something that people don't really expect is, like David is saying, that audio is king. It should actually be the first thing you think about, which is counterintuitive when you're, making a video podcast. And as a mainly audio guy, I'm glad that he said that. But I think what people don't realize is a lot of times when you're seeing a really good video podcast, what they're actually doing is recording the audio separately. And then post production, they're syncing that audio because you get much better quality going from your mic to a digital audio workstation, and then after the fact, combining that with the video. I think that's something people don't really realize. I think the other big thing is that you have to edit video differently than you would edit audio, right? So in a audio only medium, you can cut out every breath, every dead space, every and do it pretty precisely in a way that you can space it out so it doesn't sound too jumpy. You can't necessarily do that with video very easily. Um, for a variety of reasons. A lot of it just has to do with like the visual aspect of if you're looking over here, when you say and then come back to your point, you're looking over here, you cut out that it's going to be really jumpy, so that's a big thing that people don't realize, that they have to like either do some really complex editing, which I'm sure David can talk more about, where you have a multicam set. So when I'm saying and kind of looking over, you can cut to the guest, or even make it a little bit more complicated and cut to like some B-roll of like whatever I'm talking about. B-roll, by the way, is probably a term we're going to come back to, which essentially just means usually like stock footage of like whatever subject matter you're talking to. You kind of cut to a visual, either video or still image of that. So there are ways to remedy that, but yeah, I would say the two biggest things that people don't really realize is that you're syncing separately recorded audio, and then you have to have a whole different dynamic of how you do your editing in video. A lot of times to rectify having to do, two kind of edits is people will edit their video first and then just use either the audio from that as your audio only podcast, or if you want to go a further step, you can take that audio from the video and then edit the audio separately so you can kind of clean up all those ums and ahs and breaths. So that's for people who want to go kind of like the extra mile there as far as like production costs and time stuff. So I would say those are the biggest things that people don't really realize when they're jumping into wanting to do video.
Yeah. Yeah. Some other things that I've run across too are if you want to do a live video podcast, but you want to have people in person, there's a little more work to think about, like how you're going to shoot that. And Dave mentioned already, which is a really good point. Like, honestly, like for 99% of video podcasts, an iPhone is good enough, and probably a webcam is good enough, like just a basic webcam to kind of just get you a single shot, right? Like, so this is just kind of what we're shooting right now. But if you've got 2 or 3 people sitting in a room, having one flat shot that shows all 3 of them is a pretty boring video podcast. It's not that you can't do it. It's just that that's a pretty like flat and I don't know, nondescript show, versus having ISO shots between speakers and like a panned out shot. Like that's the ideal. And we've got some shows where they've got that set up. Other shows, they've sort of decided to go with the all remote recordings because it's just kind of too complicated to have that. And it doesn't look great when it's just a single flat shot. So it's a little stuff, but it honestly adds a ton of production value, in my opinion, to the end result. Just that having those multiple cameras. The other things too that I'll throw in there that are coming up a lot in the new video show launches are the subjectivity around graphics and how to do animations and cuts between things is way higher, it seems, in video than in audio. I think in audio, we've kind of got a standard way of cutting audio and cleaning it up and making it sound really good. But in video, it seems to be that there's some people who like really like quick jump shots between people and between things. There's other people who like big flashy animations between people and subject matter and stuff. And neither one I think is right or wrong, in a pure sense. It's a little more of like, what's the vibe of the show you're going for, and can you do it consistently? So I don't know if you guys have any opinions on that stuff, like as far as, how people get started making some of those decisions, or if they should even make those. Like, any thoughts on that, Dave? Maybe you've run across this too.
Yeah, quite a bit. The thing I'd say is find out what your show needs. What's the vibe of the show, and lean towards that. Lean into that. Now, the second thing is cost. Like obviously with audio, we get it, we make it sound as good as possible, send it back. With video, we do that 90% of the time. But if you want extra elements in there, then there's a lot of back and forth between revisions that,
Right.
pumps up the cost. And then because we are quite visual, we see visual things all the time. We see high, HD adverts, and we see things all the time. You have to decide what your standard's going to be and how much that's going to cost you. As far as graphics go, I think they really help, in terms of podcast. But it just depends how is it going to be a picture? Is it going to be B-roll? Again, B-roll from some kind of other medium. You kind of have to decide what you want to do. And I'd say again, it's the style of the podcast. Just do a few episodes and see what you want to lean into, what actually gets results before you start doing a lot more of that. And by the end of it, you spent so much money, but the results are only like 5% different.
Right.
If that makes sense. So yeah,
that's for sure. Say. I agree. I think I always tell people, like, look, in the first few episodes of your show, you get, unless you're, coming into this with some massive audience, there's probably not that many people watching anyway. So, give yourself some grace and figure out like some of the things that matter and don't matter in those first 5-10 episodes, and then start to really optimize and move the levers once this is working.
Okay. And I'll just add really quick, if you are going to do that, the animating and all that kind of stuff, and try to put more into the episode, I'd probably lean into more putting that into the short form or medium form content instead of like the long form podcast. So if you are deciding, hey, I think we want to do this, start with adding it to the short form, and then incrementally just moving it through whatever form of media you want to put out there.
Yeah, for sure.
It's an idea.
So if video, like obviously producing this video, editing video, getting it up there, getting onto different channels, it's more work, objectively speaking, and there's a little more work involved and cost involved in, setting up the camera setup. Maybe not a ton. Arguably, it's like, it could just be as simple as an iPhone, but maybe you want to get lights and you want to get a studio set. Like, so anyway, there's more cost, there's more time involved. Why do it? What's the upshot? Robert, I know we've talked about this in launches with a lot of clients. Like, what are some of the things you're hearing that they're drawing people to doing video podcasts versus keeping them audio only?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, first of all, it's because you're opening yourself up to a whole new audience. So you're widening your audience for people who maybe they only get their like entertainment and their news and whatever it might be on YouTube. And that's a whole new world. It's a whole different platform. The other thing is that video is way more engaging. So even if you just plan to do, maybe you start off not doing a full video podcast, but you want to record it so that you can have social media clips. The visual element is way more engaging for discoverability, for one thing, and for attention spans. So people are going to spend a lot more time looking at a video on social media than they are listening to a still image or an audiogram. So those are probably the two biggest things. We'll get into more because there are a lot of advantages, but I think also once you get kind of established and you start to build an audience, there's also another option for monetization, right? Because most of the monetization methods for audio podcasts are dynamic ad insertion, where essentially, whatever your hosting platform will just throw an ad on there, and then you get money per cost per mile is what they call it, CPM. So a certain amount of money per 1,000 listens. But then since YouTube is a totally separate platform that isn't aligned with your RSS feed the way that all the other podcast platforms are, they have a completely separate monetization system. So you can actually be monetizing the same content twice. So that may not apply to people who are just starting out, but maybe people who already have a decent audience in audio. The monetization might be a big reason why they want to make that switch and do a little bit of the extra work and pay for the little bit of the extra work and hope that the extra income will kind of balance out your production costs if you're outsourcing them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that if you think about, if you're a podcast listener, think of who recommended that podcast. How did you discover that podcast? Usually it's word of mouth. I'm just talking for myself. It's either word of mouth, somebody I really trust who's recommended a podcast, or it might be a piece of content I've watched on YouTube Shorts, TikTok, or whatever. It's rarely that I listen to a clip of a podcast and I'm like, oh, let me listen to the full thing, because I just don't listen to short form audio. I'll either watch short form content or somebody will recommend it. And to be honest, I rarely look at the top 50 podcasts on Spotify. Like, that's me. Like,
Right.
I'm not going to go top 50 and just like pick one. So, or if I've listened to a guest that's been on another podcast and they say, hey, actually, I've got this other part. So it's very still, would you call it a lead magnet kind of generating thing?
Yeah, it's very, very organic is the way I like to think of it. Like, you're right. And I agree. That's been my experience in general with podcast growth. Is like, it's mostly done through word of mouth or the kind of just hearing about it through the channels that you go on. And so, yeah, you're to your point, like every channel you're out there on is just one more distribution channel. And technically you can release an audio only podcast on YouTube, but it's not gonna, I mean, it's just not gonna perform that well just because YouTube wants real live footage. Yeah. Okay. So there's definitely some advantages. I read a stat the other day that's 47% of people prefer watching a podcast on, like, a video podcast to just listening, which is pretty wild. I imagine, and I don't have all the data on this, well, I haven't seen like a real detailed study on this, but I imagine YouTube and videos tend to skew a little younger just based on the people I've spoken to in the last several years about this. But that said, I mean, I do think there's a growing number of people of all ages going to YouTube for podcasts first for, whatever reason. And then Spotify has now made it easier in the last couple years, really. And I think they just released something this month, actually, that's going to let all shows on Spotify release a video version of their show as well, even if you're not hosted on Spotify. So that could be another angle too. So basically, they're just really embracing video. I don't know if Apple ever will, just because Apple doesn't change much in their podcast ecosystem very often, but who knows, right? They may. And so it's getting more, it's getting not just YouTube now, it's also Spotify. It's helping you there. And then the other thing you guys have pointed to already is having the video captured for your podcast opens you up to this creating micro content, whether it's short versions, like 5-minute versions of your podcast to put out as highlight reels kind of on YouTube or LinkedIn, or even more micro, like 1 minute or 30-second clips that are just, hot speaking points. Both are really nice to have. And there's now tons of tools to help you generate those, as well as, we can do that kind of thing for clients too. But really good, because then you can take this 1 hour long recording from a podcast and now turn it into 10 or 20 pieces of marketing material down the line that can help you and your guests grow their awareness of what they're doing. So that's a big one. How do you guys think about the trade-offs though? Because at the end of the day, again, like, I won't come out here and say that every podcast needs to be a video podcast. What are some cases where you definitely wouldn't, or just would kind of say it's not really something you even worry about the cost, versus cases where it's like probably should do video? Any strong opinions there?
The one thing I can think of is video gets people through the door. Audio makes them stick around. That's the way I think of it. Because consumption wise, if you look at this, if you look at a stat, if people are listening to an audio podcast and they're 5 minutes in, chances are they've put it on, they're doing some housework, gardening, or whatever they're doing. So they're busy while listening. So it's not, you don't have to be watching it. So chances are, if you're 5 minutes in, you will finish the episode. So, so to me, it's like video lures them in, make sure the content is like, it's a scroll stopper, it's good content, but audio's gonna get people to stick around, but also the content needs to be really good. So that's the way I was thinking about it today. That's the way I think of it.
That's interesting. Robert, how about you? Do you notice any times where it's like a definite needs to be video versus, probably shouldn't even be a video show?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I guess the biggest consideration, and keep in mind it depends on the context. It's different for every person. But you really need to take in consideration your budget and then the amount of time that you have to put into it, right? So if you have a budget where you can pay, a few $100s to get every episode professionally edited, um, then you should consider that. If you have enough time to maybe learn a new video editing program yourself, and then you can really, as kind of a passion project, be willing to, get past that learning curve and figure out how to do it your own to save some of the money, but think about how much time that's going to take you and how you value your time. There is actually a lot of like new technology and apps and programs and AI stuff that's considered prosumer, so like not quite professional level, kind of like consumer level, where you don't have to be a professional video editor to get a decent enough looking video edit for your podcast. So I would say that, yeah, your time consideration, your budget consideration are big things. The other thing is, as far as like why I would definitely consider doing a video podcast, is if you have that time or you have that budget to put into it, um, and your show like can benefit from visuals. So say it's like an
Right.
educational thing, where you can put up charts and pie graphs and stuff like that, that will actually aid. Or say you're a news show and you're showing clips from the daily news, you can do that, and then you can speak about things that are visual. So if you're doing an art history podcast, for example, you can put up an image of whatever painting you're talking about,
Right.
and it really like adds to the overall quality for the listener. So it really just depends. There's different contexts, but what I would say is that anyone that's considering doing a podcast and is thinking about video, like we kind of said at the beginning, you can start off at the lowest level and then scale as you grow or as you need to. Um, so even if you're just recording on Zoom with your guest, maybe you can get a couple good clips out of that, and you can use programs like Descript, for example, is a good one, where they have a free program. You can use your free Zoom. Pretty low bar to learning how to use either of those things, where you can have decent enough looking video clips to start off with. So try not to be intimidated, I would say too. But yeah, I definitely think that if you just jump right in there at whatever level that you can, and to just try to get whatever basic video content you can at the time, and then just grow it as you need. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. That's really good insight there. Yeah,
Yeah.
starting simple. The only other thing I'll add to the like, question of video versus not, I like your point, Robert, that like an art history podcast would be kind of hard to do without video or some kind of visual element, right? Like I think it's the same like video game podcasts is like it'd be hard to do video game review podcasts without a visual element somehow. Um, I'm sure there's people who do it, but it does add a lot. On the other hand, if you're going to do an interview style podcast and your guests are the kinds of people who don't have very high public profiles and don't really want to be on video, that's something to consider. And we've run into that a few times with shows where the audience and the types of guests that they get are just not people who want to have their face up places, just for various reasons. And so thinking about that with your setup is important, as well as if you're recording a podcast and people's bandwidth is limited, that may play a factor in how you record it. So there's just little practical things there that I would also just put into your consideration list. It's not like every show has to be video to do well, but it absolutely helps most shows that do go that direction, I think. Dave, anything to add there too?
The one thing I was going to say is that's probably why the 47% stat makes sense, because a lot more, because the quality is going up. People kind of want to watch what's going on in the podcast, and body language plays a big role, and just seeing people's reaction, that's like quite an interesting thing to see. And from the monetization point of view, if you look around, everybody wants to be on YouTube. It's a hard platform to grow for a reason. The monetization is great on it. And even your TikTokers, Instagrammers have got like hundreds of thousands of followers. Everybody wants to be on YouTube. So
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it's the second biggest search engine after Google, which, you know,
yeah.
it's owned by Google. So it's really the same thing. But like, you know, and I've noticed this more and more in content marketing efforts in general, that YouTube tends to be at the top of search results for a lot of things. So you'll notice if you search in like how to do X, Y, or Z in Google, you know, whatever that search is, often one of the first search suggestions they have is a YouTube video. There's a reason for that. They're trying to push it. They make money on it. But at the same time, for those of us creating content, it's like we have to be aware that that's going to be a bigger and bigger part of SEO in the future. So I think that's a worthwhile thing to consider too.
Yeah.
I've also found that in general, and you know, podcasts might play into this, but embedding a podcast episode or YouTube video onto a page, so it could be a blog post, could be just an explainer page, can absolutely increase time on site, which does also help search rankings and just retains visitors. So overall, as part of a marketing, you know, sort of efforts, having more video tends to be a good thing. But again, comes back to this trade-off of how much more work is it.
Yeah. Can I just add really quick that
Yeah.
when you've got a full hour podcast, for example, if you can find sections of your podcast that just answer a question, so the how to is like perfect. So if that answers a question, just chop that 3 or 4 minutes up and stick it up with that specific how to do X, Y, and Z. Or if it's to do with the news, if it's current, always, you know, just chop that bit up and then add a link that leads to your longer form. And the good thing is with YouTube Shorts, they've just added it in the last few months where your short form, you can actually link your related videos to the long form as well. So
Okay.
it's, do you know what I mean? It's a lot easier. So what you'll find now is a lot more people are doing short form. And if you like it, you just click on the link and you just listen to the full episode.
Yeah.
So
I think there's this
things are moving.
Yeah, I've seen this this tactic used by a few of our clients as well as others, where they'll take, like you said, Dave, the full hour-long episode. And I think one you can look up, The Drive, Peter Attia's show, they do this. Like they've got the full hour-long video, then they've got a 5 minute or several 5 to 10 minute clips that are kind of those sort of answer a specific question and the just very deep dive into one little piece. And those stand alone really nicely. And then they've got the shorts, which are, you know, 30 second to a minute long, just kind of teasers almost. I think that's a really great way to reuse that one long big piece of content into several sub pieces that can all be used in different ways and attract different keywords. And again, all just kind of links together to build awareness. So good to call that out. Let's talk about equipment. So we already touched on this just a bit at the beginning, and I think this is a question that comes up a lot because people sort of, they get overwhelmed. I mean, they even do with audio. Like, you know, honestly, like buying a mic, there's a million different mics that are around the $100 price point, and some of them are dramatically better than others. And then some people have very firm opinions. Other people have very, you know, whatever you want is going to be better than your headphones. Like, I think there's, you know, there's a lot of gray area there. Same with video, though. As you mentioned, Dave, honestly, just you know, putting up your iPhone and like getting a stand for it or something, and then pairing it to your laptop is good enough. And honestly, it's 4K. It's probably great for most people. But then you know, you may want a multicam setup. You may want to have 3 or 4 either iPhones or similar cameras set up, and then the ability to control them all, which is certainly something you can do. What are kind of the tier lists of like equipment? Like what's the starting, the baseline, which we've kind of already touched on, and then where do you go from there if you're trying to upgrade your video setup, and maybe what's the highest end? And just in rough terms, you don't have to say specific equipment necessarily. We can always send that to people if they ask.
Yeah. I'd start with lights. Lighting is the most important thing. A softbox light could cost you anywhere from like a decent one, maybe $60 to then you can go into like, but you can get a decent one for $60. And just make sure the lighting's okay. If you're lit okay, your camera just has to do less processing and less work. And I'd start with that. A lot of people go with like, you know, try to get the best camera, but a better camera means more things, more factors to consider, more excuses to not be producing the content. So I'd start with simple, just use your phone, lighting setup. and just basics of lighting. Just make sure the light's not behind you. You're not,
Mhm.
in front of a window, because you'll just be blown out. Like just stuff like that. So I'd start with lighting
Yeah,
if you
that's a
want to
good
start. Yeah.
that's a good one. Not that I'm a pro or anything at this, but it's very similar. Like when I wanted to upgrade my setup earlier this year, got like, two lights. You've got one,
Yeah.
there's kind of a very standard setup. And you can go, there's some good YouTube videos about this if you ever want to look them up.
Yeah.
But there's a light behind your camera and then one off to the right side, kind of giving you some, what do they call that, Dave? There's a name for it.
Phil.
Fill, yeah. So fill
Phil.
light.
Yeah.
Dave knows all the words. I just make it up
Uh,
as I go.
Thank you, YouTube.
You're the pro, yeah. Yeah, and then but anyway, so starting with good lighting, totally agree. It makes a huge difference. And then even little things like now in most camera software or the computer software, you can do things like mess with your f-stop, which will give you some sort of like softer fade back to the back, which looks nice. But yeah, there's a lot of things there that are quick wins that I would say, less than $100 and you're gonna, or maybe 100, $200, you're gonna be able to really upgrade your setup. Yeah, and then yeah, there are for multicam too. If you want any recommendations, feel free to send us an email. But there's a setup we've sent to a couple clients that's pretty cool where you can get these three cameras that can sit on tripods, and then you can control them all from a single like iPad or iPhone. Really easy to do. So if you're doing a multicam setup and trying to capture 3 live streams of say you're gonna record a panel at a conference or individuals
Yeah.
speaking. So there's some things like that that aren't too terribly expensive
But
that gets you. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I did send you guys it on Slack, but Apple's new update allows for a multicam setup. So all you need is just a few
There you go.
iPhones.
Yeah.
I think you might need an iPad. I need to look into this, but you could tell like it's getting a lot more accessible. Just
Right.
use what you got in your pocket and
Yeah.
you going.
I mean, that's huge because you think about like the challenge a lot of our clients will face if they're trying to set one of these, get one of these setups going is like, what if they want to go take it remote? They want to go to a conference and record. And if you can just do it with your iPhones and iPads or something, that's amazing. Like saver of
Yeah.
space and time. So yeah,
You can
fantastic.
do it now. You can Black Magic has an app out, which is like the camera app. So you
Yep.
can do it now. It is a bit more involved to get it done. It is possible.
Yeah.
But with the next update Apple's coming out with, it'll just be like integrated into your device.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Anything else on equipment wise for video that we're missing? I don't know, Robert, if you had anything else you see come up.
Well, one thing I always tell, like particularly new clients who are just starting up a podcast that want to do video stuff, particularly with remote guests, a lot of people are still using like Zoom or Skype when they're doing their remote video recordings, and there are more premium apps and hosts like Riverside is one I always recommend, or StreamYard, where they're actually uh, recording locally your video and your audio, and they just like um they have better quality overall. So, and it's an easy thing. Like even if you don't have a cheap $40 webcam, if you're just using whatever is on your laptop or your computer as a webcam, it's a place to get started and
Yeah.
it's like really easy. So that's what I would say as far as like entry level points. Um, since we already kind of discussed that audio is like, a big component of like having a good video podcast. The entry point, cost wise and from a user friendly aspect for audio is a lot lower than for video. So if you are going to do something like Riverside or StreamYard, you should at the very least invest in like a cheaper, for about $100, you can get a really decent mic that's like a USB where it's just plug and play, and it makes it really simple to get decent video quality for remote recording interview and have pretty good sound for not too much investment in either your time or learning how to use the equipment or for the cost. So that's what I would
Yeah.
say for entry level stuff at least.
You bring up a really good point too, Robert, which we almost glossed over, just kind of probably assuming too much, which is it doesn't matter how great your video camera is or even your microphone, if you're sort of like just streaming to Zoom and Zoom is just recording in the cloud, like the quality gets compressed a ton. So you lose a ton of fidelity when you do that. Now we're doing it for this webinar, so we're sort of like defying our own rules here, but that's just because it's a webinar, not a super high quality podcast. But I would say, like, yeah, you're right, Robert. One of the very first easiest upgrades is $20 a month for Riverside. Will immediately get you better quality video that's recorded locally and then uploaded, which is going to make everything look better. And you'll get separate tracks for each speaker and for audio too. So you're going to have a lot easier time editing it once you're getting into those weeds. Yeah, very, very good point, and not something to overlook. Any other software recommendations, Dave or Robert, that you guys run across that are helpful for doing a video show?
I was just smiling there because me being a geek, I'm actually recording this locally as well. I'm recording on like
of course
QuickTime, and then I've got like a camera up here. Which I hopefully get to touch on this point later. But equipment wise and app wise, I always recommend Riverside because it just works. I just had a client today. They're like, "Oh, it didn't record my guest thing." I was like, "Oh, let me go in and see." And thankfully, it was stored in the cloud. So if anything happens, there's always some kind of recording you can use because you don't want to waste people's time. That's
right.
so important.
Right.
So Riverside. Then you can get a bit more geeky with like other apps and stuff. But we'll see if anybody's got any questions. We can kind of dive into that a bit.
We dive into it further.
A bit more. Yeah.
All right, cool. So we'll put a pin in equipment, and we can absolutely answer specific questions or recommendations in the chat too. So let's talk about the future of podcasting is kind of our last question here in the last 5 minutes, and then we'll get into some more Q&A. We've all been somewhat involved. I don't know, Robert, how long have you been involved in working with podcasts and listening to podcasts? I mean, we've probably been listening since the beginning of
listening pretty early on.
Right.
But yeah, so I've been like editing or producing since like 2017. So
yeah, okay, so almost 10 years, and then Dave,
yeah, and a lot has changed. So
yeah.
Yeah, similar. Like I remember just before I feel like over 2020 pandemic, it really like ramped
really
up. But I was involved like probably 3 years before that, 3 or 4 years, trying to push everyone. Come on, guys, this is the thing.
So we've seen some shifts. I think in those 10 years that I've been paying attention to podcasting. For sure, one in the last 2 or 3 years has been more video. The video has been more common. But would you guys say that, video podcasting is the future of podcasting? Is it going to be one arm of how podcasts are done? Is it, eventually will the audio podcast be that kind of like AM radio that nobody really listens to anymore, but it's out there just because it's cheap to keep it out there? Like, I don't know. What do you guys think? And you can speculate wildly if you want, because I'm sure nobody's going to pay attention to what we think anyway.
I mean, it's hard to predict the future, of course, but you can just see the way that it's trending now and like extrapolate that to the next few years. Just the way that the podcast industry is growing itself. Like the last time I checked, there was 2 million active podcasts.
Great.
And if we're thinking, 40 something percent of those are video, nearly 1 million video podcasts. So it's definitely not going anywhere, podcasting as an audio industry or a video industry. I think there will always probably be room for audio podcasts for various reasons. I think the a lot of times like the where you see like I guess like grassroots innovation of people doing new things in podcasting are from the people who don't necessarily have the resources. They're not coming from the bigger, production houses like Amazon has Wondery and things like that, who are kind of doing things by the book and doing what other people have already done. Where I think you see innovation is people who are amateurs and just have a really great idea and are really passionate about it. And those people have lower entry points, which might mean that they would start off in audio and maybe their visuals aren't that good, so it doesn't really pick up. So I think that's really important to note that like audio is a lower entry, and I think some of the most original and creative, interesting stuff comes from people at that lower entry point. But there's a lot of other factors too that just like we had talked about before, certain things are like more attuned, work better as a visual podcast, but that's not the case for all of the listeners. So a lot of times, like data usage is one thing. So if you're going up to your cabin or you're going to be on a long flight, you can download way more podcast audio episodes than you can for video.
Right.
And even Spotify has a feature where even on video podcasts you can turn them off, so it's just an audio podcast, so that it saves that data. So that's another thing. Um, but I think also it lends itself to, because it lends itself to that entry level point, it'll always kind of be around, but I think they're kind of going to grow in tandem with each other based on listeners' preferences. So they find a video podcast on YouTube, but they're on Spotify all the time listening to their music mixes in the car or whatever. And so maybe they'll start listening to that same show, but just the audio version. And so I think it's definitely going to grow, but I don't think that audio podcasts are going to be going anywhere. So if you really can't commit to doing a full video podcast, don't give up. You can still grow your audio podcast and hopefully get to the point where you can afford to put in that time or budget to create a video podcast eventually, if that's your goal. But there are really popular podcasts that just don't do video. I
Oh,
mean,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
Mark Maron's show,
some of
yeah,
the most popular ones
WTF,
we work with as well
yeah,
are just audio. Yeah.
yeah. So it really just depends. So I think definitely podcasts in general are going to be growing exponentially, and that includes video podcasts, but I don't think it's one or the other.
Yeah.
So they just both have different advantages and disadvantages, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah. Dave, what about any thoughts on the sort of future of podcasting and where video fits into it?
Yeah, it's not going away. I'll tell you that much. And now with data being accessible, and like you get high speeds of internet and all that stuff, it's just easy to, I'm spoiled. I'll just watch everything in 4K on YouTube because I can.
Right. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So it's just there. So the quality is just going to go. It's just a lot more accessible. The one thing that it comes back to, whether it's video and audio or audio, is the content. If your content's not good, it doesn't matter if it's audio or video.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna come into this like journey of being a podcast host or podcaster, decide to incrementally get better as you go on. I'd say, and we do this with YouTube all the time. Record yourself and just watch it back for 5 or 10 minutes, and then, or what I do is I get scolded for this, but I'll edit a video, and then I'll show it to my wife, and she'll just be like, "I didn't like this," and you get more conscious, but it's part of growth. So I'd say if you are going to, commit to putting out content that you think should exist, just commit to the process and find your voice, get better at it. And you might lean into more audio, you might lean into more video, just incrementally try to get better in your content and quality wise. You'll find a lot of video shows will lean into that a bit more. Some of my favorites at the minute, I've actually started watching because of the short form. The short form is so snappy, straight to the point, hilarious, that you do want to just go and enjoy the long form and just hang out with the people. So that
Right.
might be audio or video. But yeah, I just think it's an amazing form of media to consume, and you get to know people a lot better. Video, I think body language is like such a communicative, um
Yeah. It's
I
a big
would say
feature.
it's,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
big feature of communication. So why not have that as well?
Right.
Like, yeah.
Yeah. I think I agree with all that. I think that the lines between what is a podcast versus what is a YouTube channel versus whatever, it's going to get blurrier, and there's going to be a lot more content that sort of rides the line between multiple types of things. That said, like we've all pointed out, audiobooks and physical books and movies all exist, right? So like, why isn't that? I would imagine the same will happen of other forms of media like podcasting. Podcasting will exist as well in audio form, and then it will exist in a video form, and it will probably exist in short form as well, like it does today. That said, I think if I were, if I'm starting a podcast today and my sort of target audience is anyone under 40, I would absolutely be investing in video, unless there's just some really strong reason not to, just because the audience tends to be there, and that's just such a big factor. Um, and I think if your audience is even younger, then investing in short form is like a must at this point. Just getting into Instagram, TikTok,
Yeah.
YouTube Shorts, whatever one kind of makes sense for you. But yeah, I mean, it's not going away, and it's only going to get more common, and it's going to get more competitive as well as it gets more common. So, thinking about if you're doing a new
Yeah.
show today, how do you stand out? Like one of the angles could for sure, I mean, it'll help being a video show. So, yep.
Yeah. Can I just add really quick that
Yeah.
the um how current the podcast is plays a big role, I think, in quality. So you can afford to have like a not so good webcam, podcast or quick episode that talks about something that happened today, like it's really current. If it's evergreen stuff, like you might want to make sure the quality is there. But yeah, like because financial information moves so fast, the news, like I watch loads of MMA stuff, and most of the MMA guys just have like a webcam, but they
Right.
keep up with the news that that person is going to keep up with it. So there's something to do with like current information that you can kind of just
Yeah.
probably lean back on the
Yeah.
quality a bit. If
Well,
that
it's
makes sense.
this is no, absolutely. This is always kind of a there's different schools of thought on this. There are people who put out a lot of content very frequently, but at very relatively low quality or let's say low production value. I don't mean low quality, like the content might be good, but it's just very frequent and very low production value. And then there's people on the other side who release 2 videos a year, but they're amazing and they spent tons of time on it, right? And neither one is right or wrong. I think it's just again comes down to their brand and what they feel is the right way to deliver that message. And I think it's good to know that about your brand and how your podcast should reflect that brand. If you are a very like deliberate, researched and kind of slower moving brand in a way, which is not a bad thing. It's just like that's just the way you work. You want people maybe to know that about you. Then having one video a month is probably the right move. Not trying to cram something out every single week when you can't hit the quality bar that you'd want. So there's something there to think about for sure, that it's not it's not one size fits all. And I think even that's true of audio podcasts, but it gets even more true of video podcasts because there's so many other factors, the visual factors that come into it that make it more complicated to more levers to move essentially. Anything else we didn't talk about today, guys, that would be interesting as far as video podcasting and that whole launching one, keeping up with one, thinking about, we didn't talk about metrics. That's another one we could have gotten into, we could get into. Anything else you guys are curious about or want to get into?
Well, I would just know based off that about the analytics, because I just recently wrote a blog about that, which is on our website right now. Is that podcast analytics are not quite standardized, like for just audio stuff, and it's kind of all over the map as far as like what platforms offer what things. And frankly, if you're going with like Spotify for podcasters or Acast or something that's like more basic, you don't really get great analytics, right? And Google specifically is known, maybe even infamous for their complex and very detailed analytics, which translates to YouTube, right? So if you have a YouTube show, you're going to get a lot more information about who is watching your show, how long they're watching it for, what device they're watching it from, where they got the link, all these kind of things that really factor into if you're smart about your strategy, taking in some of that information and then making decisions based off that. You don't want 100% make your decisions off of analytics because you do want to stick with, um, be true to your show and to its concept and not like be pulled in different directions. But I think it's important to note that those analytics are much better than on any audio,
Right.
RSS feed hosting site. So that might be something to factor in.
That's a good one. Yeah, let's actually, this is not, and nobody asked this in the Q&A yet, I don't think, but this was asked by a client the other day, like, what are some of the things to think about when optimizing a YouTube channel in general? So this is kind of broadens out beyond just podcasting. There's a handful of things that I recommend, but Dave, you've got some experience in this area too. Like, what do you typically kind of tell people to think about when it comes to YouTube, especially versus just the traditional quote unquote podcast platforms?
Yeah, so I get to be one of 4 people on a YouTube channel. We've got about 520K subscribers at the minute. So analytics, like we just look at the graphs and just modify content all the time. So I've spent a lot of time just looking at those. What I'd say is title and thumbnail is everything. We don't start we don't make a video unless the title and thumbnail is nailed. Because where you put it, like I can go into there's a reason Mr. Beast spends a lot of money on just the thumbnail and the colors and is his mouth open or not? Is the background? There's so much that goes into it. But just making that start. And then if it's a video on YouTube, just get straight to the point. Nobody wants to hear a 30-second intro or like watch this animation. Just get straight into it. Logo, 1 second, straight into the content. Because the first 30 seconds are so important. And if you go on YouTube, you'll see that it'll say, 58% of people watch the first 30 seconds. And like TikTok, if that percentage is up, it'll recommend it to a lot more people. So you just need to go straight in, let me know what you're talking about, and go, don't mess around.
add value, get value delivered as quickly as possible. I think that's the way I put it with a lot of clients as they're talking about this. Like you said, David, I like that. Like just flash a logo. That's all you need for the intro on YouTube now. And people can read about you in the description, right? Like there's plenty of real estate down there for people that want to dig in. But flash a logo and get right into delivering value, whether that's a teaser of what's to come in the video, or it's you just jump straight into an interview with an interesting person or whatever. And this is this goes beyond just video podcasting, but I think something in general that a lot of podcasts would benefit from is if you're an interview style podcast, there's nothing cemented in stone that says you have to spend 15 minutes talking about that person's career up to this point. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad move, but there's much more interesting ways to get into delivering value to an audience earlier, rather than just going back to tell us when you graduated college, what happened next, and then what happened next. Like we kind of all heard that. So similar on YouTube, and just thinking about how to optimize it, jump into that content and that value as quickly as possible. I like that.
Yeah,
Robert. Go ahead. No,
sorry, you just pointed it out, and I think it's great to spend. This is a smart way of like just making sure your dollar goes further. Is that teaser clip in the beginning can also be a social media piece you put out on social media. So there, you've just created 2 pieces of media that do different things, with the same amount of money essentially. Make sure that it's got subtitles. You can afford to have faster cuts in the beginning, and I can point to some examples that do it really well, but I've seen that work incredibly well as far as video podcasts.
That's good. Robert, anything else we're missing on YouTube, or anything you've heard or seen?
Well, we kind of covered a little bit, but I think it's important to reiterate why it's important to do like chapters or timestamps. So these are the little things where there'll be like kind of a topic, and it's got a hyperlink to the timestamp you click at. It goes right to what you're looking for. This is really good if you're doing long form for a couple of reasons. For one, like it optimizes your content for searchability. So like like we said before, if you're searching like, oh, how to fix a flat tire in the quickest way, whatever it might be, the first thing that's going to come up is probably a video of that, and it's probably a YouTube video. And so when you timestamp or chapterize your videos, it makes them more searchable. And it's also like if somebody's looking for something specific in that video, they'll be able to find it really quick, and they'll be able to share it really quick. And there's a lot of programs that will like automatically using AI create those chapters and hyperlinks for you. And what you can do from there is take those like individual chapters, and like David is saying, you can then clip those out for social media posts as well, depending on the length of them. So I would say that that's a really important thing to do on YouTube. The other trend that I've kind of been seeing lately is that people will do multiple titles and thumbnails. So even if something gets a lot of views, then they'll change the title of it and they'll change the thumbnail, so that when you're scrolling, you'll see a new one, and then maybe that will attract people that otherwise it wouldn't have. So I think that's a strategy that if you're looking at your analytics and you're saying like, oh, I had this headline that I thought would really grab people's attention and it didn't quite, then you can always go back and change it, and you don't have to re-upload the video or anything. You can just edit the thumbnail. So I think that's something to think about.
Can I just add, as far as the chapters go, if you don't do it, YouTube will do it for you.
Right.
So I've had it where it's been a bit janky. Like some of the time, I'm like, why did you chapter that? That's just random. But yeah, it will do it for you. But just make sure you can just go in and
Yeah,
refine
you
that.
might have to edit it. Yeah, that's a good point too.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing I would add about YouTube specifically, if this is going to be a big channel for you, is to find a way to involve your audience, whether it is encouraging comments or likes and subscribes. I mean, you hear this in most YouTube channels, like they ask specifically for likes and subscribes. There's a reason for that. It does, again, tends to elevate your show in the algorithm. But also, I think it's a cool thing about the platform. And one of the things that I, in general, with podcasting think is lacking is that two-way conversation. YouTube comments have their problems, but at least if you have a small dedicated audience and they're starting conversations, asking questions in the comments, it's really kind of cool. And it can add a lot of value both to future listeners and watchers of the show, as well as for you to get feedback on what parts of the show are people actually excited about and learning from and responding to, et cetera. So encourage that audience interactivity and comments and things like that when it makes sense. It doesn't have to just be a one-way communication channel once you're up on YouTube, because you've now got that comment system.
Yeah, and just off the back
Go
of
on.
that, oh sorry, Dave. I was just gonna say that doing live YouTube videos is a really great way to get engagement because
Yeah.
the more comments that you get, the more you'll be favored by the algorithm. So like it would show to more people if you have more comments. And if you're going live and you're asking people for questions, say, or you're asking a question, having them answer it, it really encourages people to leave a comment where otherwise they might not if it was not a live video. So that's kind of a little bit of a hack to get a little bit more engagement and then, algorithmic favors. However, it doesn't translate to every show because if your show is uh, like you're doing a lot of like visual images and like you don't want to do too much live because things could go haywire pretty easily. But if you're doing a basic, a monologue or a basic interview, I think it's good practice to at least try doing a couple of lives, and see how it goes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
I was
Yeah,
just gonna add,
final
yeah,
words.
sorry, I was just gonna add, time viewed, like how long the video's been viewed is like massive. The comment thing is valid, but you kind of have to feed that back into your show somehow. So you ask them, comment on what do you think about X, Y, Z, and then on the next show, you're like, actually, the comment said this, or you can go and feature some of the questions as content for the next episode. So it's kind of people, it's kind of feeding itself in a way. So that's, another technique you can use for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Love it. Well, guys, we're at time, so we won't keep anybody too much longer today. Thanks so much for joining. And thanks, Dave and Robert, for coming on and sharing some of the things you've been learning in the last couple of years, several years now, about video podcasts and podcasts in general. This is a lot of fun. We'll send out the recording to everyone after this in the next few days, I imagine. But if you ever have questions or you want to know more about the podcast consultant, feel free to shoot me an email, carl@thepodcastconsultant.com. But until next time, thanks again for joining, guys.
Yeah, thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
all.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks,
y'all.
guys.